We lost our baby.
Seems like nobody talks about miscarriage, so I thought it would be really important to tell our story. But I learned that it's hard to talk about miscarriage because it's hard to talk about.
Yeah, because as we were going through it, we realized how few resources there were available and how infrequent it is that people share. So,
I miscarried at 13 weeks, 4 days, and through the process we learned
that we probably lost the baby at like 8 or 9 weeks, like a couple weeks before the backpacking trip, because that's when Elsa stopped having morning sickness and had like a scare that we thought could maybe be a miscarriage. It turns out we learned that after you lose the baby, your body can hold on to the pregnancy or the results of the pregnancy for a while. And then at our 12-week appointment, going into that, we had a abdominal ultrasound. And in the abdominal ultrasound, whether or not we could find a heartbeat was pretty inconclusive. She was like hopeful at the 12-week appointment.
we didn't hear the heartbeat on the Doppler at 12 weeks, but she measured my pelvic area and said that I was measuring on point for what I should be.
As far as like from your navel to your top of your uterus or whatever, right?
From my pelvic bone to the top of my uterus.
Yeah.
So at 13 weeks, 4 days, at 3 a.m. I started cramping. We just thought it might be cramping.
Well, like you always expect the worst, but then you look for like hopeful answers. And they were saying that it could be your, like the uterine, what's it called?
The just growth of your uterus.
But there's a specific ligament that gets tugged on at that like relative time period. So we were hopeful that it could be that. But in the back of our heads the whole time, like you can't help but think that that could be what's happening.
The difference between these cramps and any other cramps that I've had before is that they were rhythmic and they didn't ever stop. They never stopped until like noon the next day. Contacted the midwife. She said it's likely contractions. And she was going through a birth that day, so she wasn't super available for a miscarriage. And I didn't want to bother her either. Like, I understand that a birth is far more important than a loss.
Well, and she's kind of got to keep her head straight going into
Right.
that. But in retrospect, it would have been really nice to just have like play-by-play for what we should expect.
You have 3 options. It's before all this, I thought miscarriage was just, you just lose the baby, you have a period, and you get back to it. But I learned that you can either miscarry naturally, where you go into, I don't know what it would have been like if I had had the miscarriage at 8 or 9 weeks, like less cramping, I'm not sure. You have a natural miscarriage where you deliver the fetus. You can have a chemical miscarriage, which is abortion pills, or you can have a surgical miscarriage, which is a DNC suction procedure. Mine is called a miscarriage. So even though the baby had died, my placenta was still releasing hormones and chemicals to make my body think that I was still pregnant. At like 9:30 that morning, we just immediately booked a motel room in town and went to do the miscarriage there. I rotated between the toilet and the bed and the shower, having contractions, bleeding. I passed mostly blood clots. What all details should I say?
I don't know. But it was super intense. I don't know. The cramps were a lot. It's like a beginning labor kind of cramps.
Like early labor is what the contractions apparently are compared to.
So it's a wild thing to go through. It's just like us two at a fucking motel.
After about 3 days of doing that, we went and had another ultrasound done to make sure that there was no more tissue left. And the ultrasound was an abdominal ultrasound, and it showed that I had a big ball of tissue still sitting on top of my cervix. It had all released from the top of my uterus, but it was down sitting on top of my cervix. They said likely something that would be a large mass to pass, because their thought at that point was still that I had had at least a 12-week gestational pregnancy that I was going to need to pass. And at that point, it has bones and it has organs and it's like looking like a human at that point. So they offered me chemical abortion pills to try to move the process along.
Misoprostol.
Or Cytotec, misoprostol or Cytotec. And what that does is it dilates the cervix and it helps open the cervix and make the uterus contract so that it releases what's inside the uterus. And that's what's most commonly taken for abortions. And it's really interesting to have learned that miscarriage, I don't know if it's what is more common, abortion or miscarriage, but the treatment for miscarriage is called abortion. Like it's an abortion procedure.
Well, it's effectively the same. Like a DNC or
It is the same.
misoprostol is like they use the exact same methods to.
And if we're just talking about language, aborting is what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Aborting a wanted baby is hard.
Also, aborting a baby that's unwanted is hard.
For sure.
And we found that out in the same place that we were having our procedure done. Not that we found that out, but it was very clear that
Nobody wants to have an
was-
abortion.
Yeah, everybody was having the worst time.
So we went back to the motel, took the misoprostol, and long story short, this whole thing is long story short. I had no symptoms, no effect. It took no effect. I actually had the best night's sleep that I had throughout the whole experience on this drug that is supposed to cause immense pain. I had still not passed anything. So I was just kind of at a loss. The next day I called an OBGYN that I had seen before and asked about a DNC surgery because I knew that would be the next step. If things aren't moving, that would be my next step. She said, just take more misoprostol. Here's 2 doses. You can take these doses within 3 hours of each other. A day later, we go pick it up. We take the first dose, nothing happens. 3 hours later, I take the second dose. And within 30 minutes, I start shivering, and that turns into just uncontrollable shaking. My whole
tremors.
entire body just shaking. And that lasted an hour and a half, but that was the only symptom that I had. And as calm and collected as you were, I think we were all pretty terrified.
Well, because Julia was there, our buddy, go. And she was just there to like kind of help us through it. 'Cause we were exhausted. And you started like shaking to where you could hardly walk. And I'm like trying to be as calm as I can and ask Julia, hey, can you like see if tremors or shakes or whatever are a common side effect of this? And she Googled it and then she's like, yeah, for sure. But just for the OB to not even, I don't know, it's just wild that how little guidance we have.
So now I'd had 3 doses of the abortion pills. I wasn't moving anything. My thoughts in my head were, my body's not letting go, which means I'm not letting go, which means something's wrong with me. I'm doing this. This is all my fault. On top of the loss, the physical aspect of it is so horribly traumatic, awful, painful, terrible, bloody experience. But then the mental side is a whole other thing that just never crossed my mind as being a part of what makes miscarriage so awful to experience and then to later talk about.
What we found out is as we were going through this, it was a lot easier to find information on if you change your language from miscarriage to abortion, because it's very similar what you're going through, but the language and like proliferation of information around miscarriage is just not there.
All I wanted to know was even just the anatomical, the actions that my body was taking. What was my body doing? It's all that I wanted to know, and I couldn't, it's like the information just doesn't exist.
And a lot of it is due to it being so unique to each individual. Like everybody has a totally different experience. And a lot of people, when they're going through like the Western medical system, they're so tuned into it the whole time that as soon as there's no heartbeat, they're like, okay, the DNC begins in 2 hours or whatever.
Because they're afraid of infection.
Yeah. And because they want to like move forward.
With no guidance, no information, no understanding of what's going on, they give you these huge choices that they just leave up to you. For liability's sake, it is at the end of the day, like I'm so grateful to have the choice, but how do you choose between waiting endlessly for the natural miscarriage, choosing a chemical miscarriage and suffering through that, or going in and having a surgery? And what I saw online is most people end up preferring the surgery because you're sedated, it's one and done, and then you're over it and you move through it. But that was the last thing that I was ever going to choose. But I did end up having to make the appointment and drive 3 hours north to go get it done. And we go in there and they do a transvaginal ultrasound, which is a lot more detailed and gives you a lot better information. And what they saw, this was a week after the abdominal ultrasound, was that I had no tissue or very little tissue. They tested my HCG levels and it was very, very low. And at that moment, after this whole week of just thinking that I had had a whole baby that wasn't passing, that I was messing up, I was the cause, that my body had actually done the whole thing on its own. It had operated perfectly. It was like just such a mind fuck, such a trip to come to that conclusion. It was Barron's cousin, who was 2 weeks ahead of me in pregnancy, who I'd been talking to, of course, throughout the whole pregnancy and everything, who was the one to say, Elsa, I think that you actually lost the baby early. With the transvaginal ultrasound, I went back to this image that I had taken. It was the only picture I took of tissue that I had passed. It had a cord at the bottom of it, so I took a picture like, what could this be? What I learned after this is I had taken a picture of the baby. I'd gotten to hold it, which was cool, I guess. It was hardly bigger than my thumbnail. And what I think happened was we lost it just a few days after we heard the heartbeat at 8 weeks. I guess I got to see what labor could possibly be like.
Learned like what it's like to be pregnant, just generally.
Yeah, I got to go through morning sickness so that I'm better prepared for next time.
We got a fridge and like extra water and like got our provisions ready. Like we know relatively what you're going to be going through.
I got to see what miscarriage is like. If I have to go through it again, I'll be naturally better prepared. We get more time to make our house better for our kid. There's so many things in this that are great, wonderful things.
Lots of silver lining, but it still sucks.
We're really excited to try again. I had so much more that I thought I was going to say in this, that there's so much more to this.
I think when it's less fresh, well, it'll be good to like do a podcast or two or like talk about it more.
It's hard to talk about it currently because it's hard to relive. I think that's what is the worst part of it. You want more people to talk about it, but then it's just so hard to talk about. So this is as much as I think we're going to share for now, and maybe we'll dive in more later. Yeah, this is what it is. So I know that there's a lot of you who want to support us. Buy a copy of Barron's book, share it with a friend. You're going to love it if you haven't read it already. If you have read it already and are still looking for ways to support us, we have a Patreon. Is it weird to be like, I don't know, whatever. We have a Patreon.
All your jewelry is announced on it first.
We release jewelry, all my rings and everything. I tell patrons first. That's what we give to our patrons. Links to those things will be in the description. Okay.
We'll be back to our normal stuff soon.
Okay, that's it.